Well, good morning. We're officially now into August. Summer is well underway, and it's hard to believe, but if you really think about it, we're nearing the end of 5 months of COVID related adaptations to our schedule at church. Nearly 5 months ago, we shut down for a couple of months. To almost already now 3 months ago, 12 weeks ago, this Sunday, we've moved to a new schedule of Sunday mornings and Wednesday nights only. I know many people are anxious about getting back on Sunday school schedules or back to Sunday nights. Not sure when any of that'll happen. We just want to be protective and cautious with your health and our well-being. But I understand it and I appreciate the desires and know that we're constantly thinking about these things, trying to consider what's the best course of actions for the church and for those around us. This morning, we're in Psalm number 36. We've been in the Psalms now for obviously 35 previous sessions, but we've been in the Psalms now since sometime in March, thinking through how we read the Psalms, what it is the Psalms are saying to us. And I think you've perhaps been shocked by how many of these Psalms seem so perfectly fitted to our current situation. Many of them are from King David. Many of them have been prayers for deliverance, prayers for protection. This morning is another prayer as David addresses God and he thinks about the evilness of man's heart and compares it with the goodness of God's. And so this morning, if you would, go ahead and read along with me in Psalm number 36, and let's see what David has to say to us this week. Transgression speaks to the wicked, deep in his heart. There is no fear of God before his eyes. For he flatters himself in his own eyes, that his iniquity cannot be found out and hated. The words of his mouth are trouble and deceit. He has ceased to act wisely and do good. He plots trouble while on his bed. He sets himself in a way that is not good. He does not reject evil. Your steadfast love, O Lord, extends to the heavens, your faithfulness to the clouds. Your righteousness is like the mountains of God. Your judgments are like the great deep. Man and beast you save, O Lord. How precious is your steadfast love, O God. The children of mankind take refuge in the shadow of your wings. They feast on the abundance of your house, and you give them drink from the river of your delights. For with you is the fountain of life. In your light do we see light. Oh, continue your steadfast love to those who know you, and your righteousness to the upright of heart. Let not the foot of arrogance come upon me, not the hand of the wicked, nor the hand of the wicked drive me away. There the evildoers lie fallen. They are thrust down, unable to rise. And so again, David is thinking about here the depravity of man's heart, our fallen condition, what we're like apart from a relationship with God, what it's like to live outside that covenant relationship and the faithfulness and obedience that comes with it, and comparing that to the goodness and greatness of God's heart, the heart that offers forgiveness, the heart that can restore and make things right again. And so let's walk our way through it and let's see what David has to say. He begins by describing the wicked first. Transgression, he says, speaks to the wicked deep in his heart. Evil, sin, talks to us here. Now, of course, we know these are analogies. These are images, right? They're word pictures that our hearts are organs that beat and push blood through our system, but they speak to what's at our core, what's deep inside of us. And here David says of the wicked, transgression speaks to the wicked. Sin appeals to us. It calls to us. While hopefully at this point in your spiritual walk, you're offended by sin, we all have certain sins that we ignore, that don't bother us, that we're so accustomed to them we don't even notice them, that we overlook them. But there are some who just call to us, that tempt us, that draw us towards them because there's something deep in our hearts that's attracted to it. Transgression speaks to the wicked deep in his heart, David says. Why is that? That's explained in the second part of verse 1. There is no fear of God before his eyes. Now, just as the writer of Proverbs speaks of the fear of the Lord as the beginning, right, of this relationship with God, here for those who are not in relationship with God, the truly sinful, there is no fear, he says, of God. Now here the fear of God is not simply just the reverence and respect of God that comes with godly fear. Here the idea is probably that of there's no fear of judgment. They're not worried about God. They're not concerned about what he may or might not do. They're not concerned about him, maybe perhaps because they don't even believe he exists. And so there's no fear of being caught. There's no fear of punishment. There's no fear of God before their eyes, and so they do whatever they want to do. Since he's not worried about God, what drives him? What motivates him? Verse 2 speaks to that end. It says, for he flatters himself in his own eyes that his iniquity cannot be found out and he's hated. He's fooling himself. He thinks he's all right. I'm not that bad. I'm not that bad of a person, I've been told when trying to evangelize in the past. Many of us justify our sins by saying, well, at least I'm not doing, and we fill in the blank with somebody we want to compare ourselves to. We're flattering ourselves, David says. We're fooling ourselves into believing we're better than we are. In fact, he goes on to say in verse 3, the words of his mouth are trouble and deceit. They're lies. He has ceased to act wisely and to do good. He plots trouble even while on his bed, he says in verse 4. He sets himself in a way that is not good. He does not reject evil. And so even lying down at night, the evil one is thinking about what he can do next, thinking about his sins, compounding his wickedness with new wickedness, inventing new ways to sin. Those of you who've been around for a while, think about all the changes you've seen in our culture and our society. Think of all the new ways to sin. Now, the sins themselves are not new, but we have invented over and over and over again throughout the course of history new ways to indulge ourselves in our sinful desires and behaviors. Does it while laying in bed, rather than thinking about goodness of God, rather than praying, rather than going to sleep and sleeping the peace of righteousness. He's laying in bed thinking about evil and more evil. On the other hand, verse 5 begins the discussion of what is God like. Verse 5, your steadfast love. David loves that word steadfast. It shows up many times in the Psalms. The steadfast love of God endures forever is a very common refrain. Your steadfast, ongoing, unending, committed love, David says. O Lord, it extends to the heaven, your faithfulness to the clouds. In other words, there are no barriers, there's no boundaries, there's no territorial markers. God's love is expansive and extensive. It extends to the heavens, this covenant love with his people. Likewise, he says in verse 6, your righteousness, God's goodness, his purity, his holiness, it's like the mountains of God. Think of great size and scale of mountains. Think of how they're solid and unmoving. Your judgments are like the great deep. And so from the highest peaks of the Himalayas to the deepest depths of the ocean in the Marianas Trench, God's holiness or righteousness is like that. It's expansive, seemingly no end in either direction. Man and beast, he says at the end of verse 6, you save, O Lord. That's our hope, that the goodness and the greatness of God, whose love and righteousness demands that we fear him, is also such that he saves us. How precious, David says in recognition of that fact in verse 7, is your steadfast love, O God. The children of mankind take refuge in the shadow of your wings. Now, could be two ideas here in David's imagery of the shadow of your wings in verse 7. One is that we know from the imagery that's described of God's throne in the Old Testament, and even think of the Ark of the Covenant, is this picture of angels stretching out their wings across the Ark of the Covenant to one another, or on the throne, stretching out from the throne. Or it could be just simply an image from nature, thinking of birds who shelter their young chicks under their wings to protect them. I remember years ago there had been a great fire in Yellowstone National Park, and the workers, as they were talking about walking through the park after the fire, just looking at the utter devastation, saw a strange lump of ash on the ground. And as they got closer, they realized it was in the shape of a bird. A bird had landed on the ground during the fire and been consumed, incinerated, cremated, if you will, and all that remained were ashes piled up in the shape of a bird. Disgusted with what they saw, heartbroken over that idea, the worker then flicked at the pile of ashes with his or her booted toe and knocked away the ashes, and what was underneath but a clutch of baby chicks that the mother had died protecting through the fire. And so here's this image that God protects us in the shadow of his wings. They overstretch us, his holiness, his righteousness, his love, and protects us. Likewise, the children of mankind, verse 8 goes on to say, feast on the abundance of your house. The idea of, think of going to grandmother's house on Thanksgiving and there's more food there than for all the people there, enough to feed an army, is a saying we often heard in our house. They feast on the abundance of your house, and you give them drink from the river and I love the imagery here, from the river of your delights. That which pleases God is what he's using to give us drink. That is what pleases him, then can one day also please us. He gives them drink from the river of delights. For with you is the fountain of life. From God flows life. Another image common throughout the Old Testament and even into the New, that life flows from God. And in your light do we see light. Think of just there in verse 9 alone, or two images Jesus often uses. He is the life of the world. He's the light of the world. Now you know where he's picking up a lot of that imagery from. Verse 10, oh, continue your steadfast love to those who know you. Now, of course, if it's steadfast love, it will continue, but that's David's prayer. Keep showing me that love and your righteousness to the upright of heart. Let not the foot of arrogance come upon me. Think of an enemy, as somebody who's attacking you, wanting to hold you down with their feet, nor the hand of the wicked to drive me away. Protect me, Lord, from the evil around me. And then there in verse 12, there the evildoers lie fallen. They are thrust down, unable to rise. When God protects us, evil is put at its end. And so he begins the psalm acknowledging just how evil man is. He builds the psalm around the idea in the middle of how good God is. And in the end, he prays that God would protect him from evil, kill it, slay it like a giant, and push it away from David, that he might enjoy God's steadfast love, his mercy and grace forever. I pray this morning that that is your desire, that God will love you, that he'll watch over you, that he'll keep you. And I also pray that you'll be living that out in such a way that those who meet you on the street, who see you in the store, who read your posts on social media, may they know the steadfast love of God through your life, and may you be a faithful witness to the end. For all these things we ask and pray in Jesus' name.